They thought he was just another man dragged in chains, humiliated in front of his neighbors. Fake officers snapped the cuffs tight. Karen smirked in her white dress, and whispers spread that justice had finally come. But the truth twisted like a knife. This wasn't an arrest, it was an ambush, and the man in cuffs was no ordinary target. He was the sheriff of police. What happened next shattered every lie the HOA had built. Before we continue, show your support. Hit that like button and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The cuffs clicked shut with a final snap that silenced the block. Neighbors leaned in, phones shaking in their hands, recording what they thought was justice. Karen stood there in her white dress, arms crossed, a smirk carved into her face like she had already won. The fake officers shoved him forward, barking orders, and the crowd whispered that the mighty had finally fallen. Every eye was locked on him, but none of them knew the truth. He didn't resist. He didn't beg. He laughed, a low, cutting laugh that rolled across the street and froze even the children peeking from behind their parents. The officers gritted their teeth, pushing him harder, but the sound of his laughter only grew louder, sharper, like a man daring the world to question him. Neighbors gasped. Who laughs in chains? Who laughs in the face of humiliation? Only someone who knows something no one else does. Karen's smirk faltered for a second, but she snapped it back, calling out that justice was finally being served, that no one was above the law. Her words cracked through the air, feeding the crowd with venom. The man lifted his head, eyes locked on hers, and whispered words only the officers could hear. Their grip tightened instantly. One of them blinked, swallowing hard, like he'd just been told his own funeral date. The whispers grew. A neighbor shouted that they wanted to know what crimes he had committed. Another yelled to take him away before he ran. But the man in the cuffs tilted his wrists deliberately, letting the light catch the fake metal, a mocking grin spreading across his face. He wasn't fighting their story. He was letting it build, letting the tension coil tighter and tighter until it snapped back at them. The fake officers tried to drag him toward the waiting car, but his words cut through their control like a blade. He told them they were wearing costumes, not uniforms. He told them their badges wouldn't pass a second of scrutiny. He told them the wrong person had been chosen for this theater. And then, with a smile sharp enough to slice steel, he dropped the truth that shattered the illusion. He was the sheriff of police. Gasps erupted, disbelief spread like fire, and every phone recording shook as people screamed. Karen's face drained of color, but her pride chained her tongue. The officers stiffened, caught in their own trap, masks slipping, eyes darting like prey, realizing the hunter had been disguised all along. The sheriff leaned in close, his voice calm but venomous, daring them to tighten the cuffs because the tighter they pulled, the faster their lies unraveled. Laughter broke again, louder this time, rolling like thunder. He wasn't a prisoner. He was a storm they couldn't cage. The neighbors who seconds ago condemned him now stared in confusion, doubt creeping in, fear whispering that they had been cheering for the wrong side. Every eye darted between the fake officers and the man they thought was broken, but who now stood taller with every breath. Karen stepped forward, her heels cracking against the pavement, demanding they silence him. She hissed that he was lying, that this was his last performance before being dragged away. But the sheriff only tilted his head and asked the crowd if they wanted proof. Phones lifted higher, recording every word, because proof meant fire, and fire meant blood. The fake officers froze, sweat trickling down their necks. The sheriff leaned forward, whispering once again, and this time one officer's face drained pale. His jaw clenched, his eyes darted to Karen, and for the first time he realized he wasn't the predator in this scene, he was the bait. The second officer stuttered, gripping the cuffs like they would save him, but even his hands shook. The crowd roared louder, demanding answers, torn between believing Karen's fury or the sheriff's steady defiance. He lifted his hands, chains glinting, daring everyone to look closer. Neighbors squinted, realization spreading as they noticed the imperfections. The badges didn't shine right, the cuffs didn't lock like real steel, the uniforms didn't fit like authority. Every detail screamed counterfeit, and the crowd gasped as the lie unraveled. Karen screamed for them to take him, to shut him up before he poisoned the street with his words. But the sheriff only smiled, his voice cutting clean through the chaos. If they wanted to see justice, it was about to arrive with sirens. And right on cue, the distant wail of police cars echoed closer, louder, filling the air with a promise of reckoning. The fake officers froze. The crowd turned. Karen's face twisted, fury boiling into panic. Real sirens. Real authority. Real consequences. And in that moment, every phone stayed up, every heart pounded, and every neighbor held their breath. The sheriff leaned forward, whispering once more, his eyes locked on the imposters. The words were simple, sharp, and final. He told them their time had just run out. The air snapped in silence as the sirens grew louder, closer, swallowing the street whole. The fake officers' masks slipped completely, fear written in their trembling eyes. And as the crowd gasped, the cliffhanger cut through every heart watching. Whose side would the real police take when they arrived? The sirens grew louder, echoing like a war drum, cutting through the lies that had chained the street. The fake officers stiffened, still gripping the cuffs as if metal could shield them from truth. The sheriff tilted his head, that grin still carved on his face, and told them to hold on tight. He wanted everyone to see who would be exposed first. The crowd leaned in, torn between fear and hunger for answers. One neighbor shouted that the real police would clear this up, that they wouldn't risk siding with a man already in chains. Another yelled that no one could fake an arrest this clean unless there was truth behind it. Karen silenced them all with a single shout, her voice shrill and commanding, promising that the sheriff's reign of intimidation was finished. She told them he had finally met his match. But her eyes betrayed the panic she couldn't cage. The sheriff chuckled, leaning closer to the imposters, speaking so only they could hear. Their faces drained instantly, eyes darting to the crowd, to Karen, to the street where real squad cars raced closer. He wasn't pleading. He wasn't bargaining. He was daring them to gamble their freedom against his silence. Every second that passed, his words cracked them deeper. Karen stepped forward, arms crossed tight over her chest, white dress catching the eyes of the crowd. She called him a fraud, a man hiding behind empty titles. But the sheriff threw her accusation back, telling the neighbors to look at the details she hoped they'd ignore. Badges chipped, cuffs that didn't lock right, belts missing the weight of real weapons. He wasn't asking for trust. He was dragging their attention to the cracks in her plan. Phones shook as people zoomed in, whispers erupting, realizations spreading like sparks in dry grass. The fake officers pulled hard on the cuffs, desperate to drag him away before the truth spread any further. But he laughed again, mocking their strength, daring them to pull harder. The more they struggled, the more obvious their incompetence became. Every tug was proof they weren't what they claimed to be. Then the wail of sirens snapped the crowd's attention. Police cruisers surged into view, lights flashing, tires screeching, a wall of real authority crashing into the scene. The fake officers froze, sweat dripping, and for a split second, even Karen's confidence cracked. She hissed at them to stay in control, but her voice broke, and the crowd heard it. Doors flew open, real officers stepped out, hands on belts, eyes locked on the spectacle. Confusion etched their faces as they took in the scene, one of their own in cuffs, dragged by strangers. The sheriff raised his chained hands high, mocking smile daring the imposters to keep their grip. He told the arriving officers to check the badges. Just check. That single word was enough to freeze the air. The real officers hesitated, suspicion flashing in their eyes. The crowd chanted for proof, voices colliding like a storm, demanding the truth now. Karen shouted louder, insisting the sheriff was dangerous, claiming she had called these officers to protect the neighborhood. But her words sounded thinner than ever, drowned by the echo of truth spreading in every gasp and whisper. One real officer stepped forward, reaching for the imposter's badge. The fake officer yanked back, stammering excuses, but it was too late. The hesitation alone betrayed him. The sheriff tilted his head, eyes gleaming, and told the crowd this was their show, their moment to see who had been lying all along. The real officer moved fast, ripping the badge from the imposter's chest. He studied it, eyes narrowing, his jaw tightening as he turned it over in his hands. Silence rippled across the street. The badge was nothing but cheap metal, the engraving wrong, the seal smudged. He looked up at the crowd, and the truth fell like a hammer. Fake! Gasps exploded, neighbors shouting, pointing, cursing the imposters. Phones caught every second, streaming live, spreading faster than Karen could control. Her face burned red, fury twisting into desperation as she ordered the fake officers to hold the line. But their bodies sagged, masks slipping completely, knowing the game was up. The sheriff leaned closer, whispering again, his voice steady as stone. He asked them how long they thought they could keep playing dress-up in a world where truth always bleeds through. One officer trembled, muttering that they were only following orders. The sheriff's grin sharpened, throwing the words back at Karen, asking the crowd whose orders they thought these cowards were following. Every eye snapped to her. Every finger pointed. Her arms crossed tighter, her smirk gone, her breath caught. She tried to scream that this was slander, that he was twisting it all, but her words tangled in the roar of the crowd. The sheriff's voice cut clean through the chaos, sharp and commanding, telling the officers to run the numbers on those badges right now. Phones locked on the scene, neighbors chanting for the truth, children clutching their parents, the street pulsing with tension. The real officers stepped aside, radios crackling, the command given. Everyone held their breath. Seconds stretched like eternity. Karen's chest rose and fell, her calm unraveling, her eyes darting like a cornered predator. And then the response came through the radio, sharp, final, undeniable. No record, no department, no existence. The badges were ghosts. The imposters were nothing. The crowd erupted, gasps colliding with cheers, the street splitting in shock. Karen staggered, her power bleeding into the pavement, her empire cracking in front of every witness. The fake officers looked at her, desperate for a lifeline, but she turned her face away, abandoning them like pawns burned in a losing game. The sheriff raised his chained hands once more, voice steady, daring everyone to remember what they just saw. He told them this was the cost of letting corruption nest in their homes. He told them the fight wasn't over. It was just starting. The crowd roared, recording every second, history etched into their screens. But as the sheriff lowered his arms, Karen's lips curled into a twisted smile, her voice steadying again with venom. She wasn't finished. She screamed that he might have won the crowd, but he hadn't won against her. She claimed she had leverage beyond their imagination. The neighbors froze, tension snapping back like a whip. What leverage could she possibly hold? The sheriff's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched, as the real officers closed in on the fake ones. The crowd screamed for answers, hearts pounding. Karen leaned forward, her white dress gleaming under the lights, her eyes burning with malice. She told him his past was about to catch up with him, and when it did, no badge in the world could save him. The crowd gasped, the sheriff's grin flickered, and the silence cut deeper than any scream. What did she mean? What secret could bring a sheriff to his knees? The cliffhanger cracked wide open, and the street braced for the next blow. The crowd trembled with confusion, every whisper sharp as a blade. Every eye locked on Karen as her words dripped poison. She had leverage, she said, leverage that could burn the sheriff's world to ash. The fake officers, cornered and trembling, stared at her in disbelief, realizing she was willing to throw anyone under the bus to save herself. The sheriff didn't flinch, but the smirk was gone. His silence weighed heavier than any outburst could. Karen's voice cracked with venom as she accused him of using his badge as a mask, claiming he had secrets buried so deep that even the law couldn't protect him. Gasps scattered like sparks, neighbors clutching their mouths, children pulled back by frightened parents. She waved a file in her hand, thick papers stuffed inside, promising the sheriff wasn't the hero they thought. She said she had proof, forged or not, and in that moment, perception began to tilt. The sheriff stepped forward, chains clinking, voice sharp, declaring she was lying. He told her the difference between her world and his was simple. He faced every scar, every sacrifice in daylight, while she built empires in the dark. But his words were cut by her shrill laugh, slicing through the crowd, feeding doubt into their veins. She told the neighbors to ask themselves why she, a woman with everything to lose, would stand against him unless she had the truth. Phones swayed, recording every second, comments streaming live across the screens of strangers miles away. Some cheered for the sheriff. Others whispered that maybe Karen was right. Doubt is a disease, and she fed it with every breath. The sheriff clenched his fists in the cuffs, refusing to give her the satisfaction of watching him crack. But deep down, her words cut like glass against old wounds. One neighbor shouted that they deserved to know the truth, and Karen's eyes flared with triumph. She opened the file, flashing documents covered with stamps and signatures, alleging misconduct, betrayal, even abandonment. She claimed he had once turned his back on his own partner. That blood was on his hands. The crowd erupted, voices colliding, rage mixing with disbelief. The sheriff's jaw tightened, voice steady but burning with rage. He told them, lies have a way of multiplying until even the liar drowns in them. He admitted scars from his past, but not betrayal. He told them sacrifice isn't clean, justice isn't soft, and those who stand on the front lines bleed while others watch from windows. His voice cracked through the mob, daring anyone to call him a coward after everything he had endured. Karen smiled, twisting his words into another dagger. She shouted that he was confessing, that even he couldn't hide from the truth anymore. She pushed forward, forcing the papers into the air, letting the crowd see stamps that looked real enough to fool anyone not trained to know better. Panic spread, the crowd shouting, some turning away from the sheriff, others cursing Karen. The street boiled with division. But then, a voice cut through the chaos, trembling yet strong. A young neighbor, no more than 12, shouted that Karen had been targeting families for years, threatening parents, blackmailing them with lies. The crowd gasped, turning not to the sheriff, but to the child. The boy's mother pulled him back, fear etched in her face, but the words were already out. Karen's eyes narrowed, her smile fading, fury sparking in her chest. The sheriff raised his hands again, cuffs digging into his wrists, voice booming with authority. He told the crowd this was the moment to decide whether fear would rule them or truth. He told them Karen's lies could only live as long as they allowed her power to choke them. Phones shook harder, hearts raced faster, the air thick with the weight of choice. Karen's laughter returned, harsher this time, mocking the sheriff's plea. She raised her hand, and from her phone came the threat that froze even the strongest voices. A video. She claimed it would expose him once and for all. A recording that would make every word he said crumble into dust. The crowd's roar cut to silence. Every eye locked on her, every phone aimed, waiting to see the destruction she promised. The sheriff's gaze didn't falter. He told her to play it. His voice calm, steady, like a man who had been through fire before and was willing to walk through it again. Karen's smirk twisted as she prepared to hit play, promising the end of his name, his title, his authority. The imposters backed away, sweat dripping. The real officers frozen in the balance, the crowd unable to breathe. Karen's finger hovered above the screen, her white dress shining under the street lights, her eyes locked on the sheriff with pure venom. She whispered that once the video played, his reign was over, his truth erased, his home destroyed. The crowd leaned in, tension coiling like a snake ready to strike. The sheriff didn't move. His chains dangled, his face carved in stone, his words slicing the silence like fire. Play it. The air split, and the cliffhanger screamed in every heart watching. What could the video possibly show that would shatter everything? The file in Karen's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of a cornered predator. She raised it high for everyone to see, shouting that the sheriff's mask had finally slipped. The neighbors leaned forward, phones capturing every page she waved. She painted him as a fraud who built his career on betrayal, a man who sacrificed his own to climb higher. Gasps spread like a wildfire, the crowd torn between loyalty and suspicion. The sheriff's jaw tightened, every muscle in his body screaming to break free from the cuffs, but his voice stayed steady. He didn't deny his past. He didn't try to bury the scars she unearthed. Instead, he told the crowd the truth was far uglier than any paper could capture. His partner had died not because he turned away, but because the badge meant bleeding first, so others could live. He said sacrifice was never clean, and anyone who claimed justice came without scars was lying. Karen laughed, her white dress glowing under the lights, her face twisted with triumph. She shouted that he was finally confessing, that even he admitted to blood on his hands. The crowd roared louder, some spitting words of betrayal, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Phones trembled in hands, comments on live streams exploded. Then, one voice cut through the mob, strong and raw. An older neighbor stepped forward, eyes glistening, shouting that the sheriff had once carried his son out of a wreck that should have killed him. Another shouted that he had stood against gangs when everyone else hid. Stories burst out from the very people Karen had bullied into silence. Her control cracked, the mob she manipulated shifting in real time. The sheriff lifted his cuffed wrists, blood trickling where steel bit into skin, his voice booming over the chaos. He dared Karen to keep waving those papers because every lie she screamed only dragged more truth into the open. He told the crowd to ask themselves who they trusted more, a man who stood in chains before them or a woman who had built her empire on fear. Phones angled closer, comments surged with hearts and fire emojis, people demanding justice. Karen's smile faltered, but she wasn't finished. She hissed that if they wanted proof, she had more than papers. She claimed there was a video that would tear away the last shreds of his reputation. The crowd gasped, silence slamming into them. Even the real officers froze, torn between duty and disbelief. Karen's finger hovered over her phone like a trigger. She whispered that once the video played, no badge could shield him, no crowd could save him. The sheriff didn't flinch. His eyes locked on hers, and with a voice steady as steel, he told her to play it. His defiance shook the crowd, leaving them breathless. Who dares demand their own destruction? Who dares face the fire with a smile? Karen's laugh cracked, shrill and venomous, as she promised the end of his name. But the crowd, hungry and restless, demanded to see it now. They shouted for her to show them everything, to stop hiding behind words. The street pulsed with tension, phones lifted higher, waiting for the fall. The fake officers, still held in the grip of the real police, shifted nervously, eyes darting between Karen and the sheriff. Their leader finally stammered that this wasn't what they signed up for. His words sparked another eruption of whispers. The imposters weren't loyal soldiers. They were pawns, and pawns break when the board tilts. Karen snapped at them to shut up, her mask of control breaking. She told the crowd that the sheriff had fooled them all, but her words no longer carried the same venom. The air belonged to him now. Every second she delayed was a second her power slipped. The sheriff leaned forward, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. He told her she could wave papers, scream lies, and hold her threats, but the truth was already unraveling in front of every witness. He told her that once the video played, the only name ruined would be hers. The crowd gasped again, phones shaking in anticipation, every eye locked on the device in her hand. Karen smiled, lips trembling with fury, and promised that when the video rolled, it wouldn't just destroy him. It would expose something no one on that street was ready to face. The silence before the storm pressed on every chest, heavy and unrelenting. She hovered her finger above the screen, eyes burning with malice, whispering one last time that the truth was about to bury him. And then, with the crowd on edge, the real cliffhanger snapped into place. Karen's screen lit up, but before she pressed play, the sheriff spoke for words that froze everyone in their tracks. For words that changed the meaning of everything they thought they knew. Karen's smile widened as the sheriff's words hung heavy in the air. She tapped her phone, but instead of a video, she leaned in close and whispered a name. A single name that sliced deeper than any accusation, a name that cracked the sheriff's composure for the first time. His eyes widened, his chest tightened, and for one fleeting second, the man who had laughed in chains looked human, vulnerable, and haunted. The crowd erupted, demanding to know who it was, what it meant, and why the sheriff's defiance faltered. Karen repeated the name louder, letting it echo through the street, feeding the mob's curiosity like gasoline to a fire. She shouted that this was the ghost he had buried, the secret he prayed would never crawl back into daylight. Neighbors gasped, children stared, and even the officers stiffened, sensing they had stumbled into a history darker than they imagined. The sheriff clenched his fists, his wrists bleeding under the cuffs, his jaw locked as memories surged like bullets through his mind. He told her to stop. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the storm raging within. Karen's laugh split the silence, shrill and victorious. She said the name again, dragging it like a blade across his reputation, daring him to deny it, daring him to break. The crowd whispered, some murmuring that they had heard the name before, others clutching at rumors long buried. Phones zoomed in, recording every flinch, every flicker of pain in the sheriff's face. For the first time, doubt wasn't fueled by Karen's lies, it was painted on the sheriff's silence. He broke the stillness, his voice raw and jagged. He admitted that the name was real, that it was someone tied to his scars. He told the crowd that justice always demands a price, and sometimes that price is higher than anyone should ever pay. His words cracked with grief, but instead of sympathy, Karen twisted them into guilt. She screamed that his silence proved everything, that he had betrayed his own blood. The crowd roared again, chaos splitting them into two halves, one defending the sheriff's years of sacrifice, the other cursing him for what they believed he had hidden. Karen's voice soared above them all, demanding the neighbors choose. Was he their savior, or a traitor who hid behind the badge? The mob teetered on the edge of frenzy, and for the first time the sheriff's fate hung in their hands. But then, a neighbor spoke up, an elderly woman, her voice shaky but fierce. She shouted that the sheriff had once stood in front of her house when armed men threatened to burn it down, that he had taken blows meant for her husband. Another voice joined, then another, piling truth over truth until the crowd began to fracture Karen's illusion. Their voices collided, shouting that one mistake, one scar, didn't erase a lifetime of protection. The sheriff raised his voice again, sharp and commanding. He told them he would not run from the past, that he carried it every day, heavier than chains. He admitted mistakes, but never betrayal. He said the name Karen weaponized was tied not to cowardice, but to sacrifice, the kind no one who hadn't stood on the edge of death could ever understand. His voice cracked, his body trembling, but the crowd heard truth in his pain. Karen's eyes narrowed, her smirk fading as control slipped. She hissed that words weren't enough, that the video would end this debate forever. She lifted her phone higher, claiming that the recording showed the sheriff's weakness, his failure, his betrayal caught in cold reality. The crowd held their breath, tension snapping taut once more. But before she pressed play, the sheriff shouted over her, his voice cutting through the frenzy. He told the crowd to ask themselves one question: who had really been destroying their lives? Who had bullied them, fined them, humiliated their children, and threatened their families? He demanded they look at her, not him. And as he spoke, neighbors began shouting back at Karen, throwing her own sins into the light. Her mask cracked completely, fury twisting her face, and for the first time the smugness vanished from her white dress stance. She screamed that she was their only protection, their only shield against chaos. But her words were drowned in a sea of voices rising against her. Karen's rage boiled over, and with trembling fingers, she finally pressed play. The crowd froze, eyes glued to the glowing screen, waiting for the truth to explode. And in that silence, the cliffhanger roared louder than any siren. What did the video really show? The video lit up the screen, shaky footage filled with chaos, sirens in the background, voices screaming. The crowd leaned forward, eyes wide, their breaths trapped in their throats. Karen held the phone like a dagger, triumphant as the image showed the sheriff on his knees, blood on his hands, his partner lying motionless beside him. Gasps ripped through the crowd, the sight twisting stomachs and tightening throats. Karen shouted over the noise that this was the proof, the betrayal caught forever, the moment he abandoned his oath. She raised her hand, pointing at the sheriff in chains, demanding the neighbors look at the man they had trusted for years. Phones zoomed closer, streaming the scene to thousands watching online. The mob shook with fury, some screaming for him to be taken away, others too stunned to speak. The sheriff's face tightened, his eyes burning with grief, but his voice cracked through the chaos. He told them that what they were seeing was not betrayal, but sacrifice. He shouted that his partner had begged him to carry out the mission, to leave him behind, to save the civilians trapped in the line of fire. He told them the blood on his hands wasn't proof of abandonment. It was proof of duty, of a promise kept at the highest cost. Karen sneered, twisting his words, claiming he was rewriting history to mask his cowardice. She demanded the crowd ask why the video showed him leaving, why it didn't show him fighting to the last breath. But before the mob could erupt again, a voice rose from the back, raw and trembling. A woman cried out that the man lying in the video was her brother, and that before he died, he had told her the sheriff had saved more than 20 lives that day. The silence that followed was deafening. The sheriff's chest heaved, his wrists bleeding from the cuffs, his eyes locked on Karen. He told her she could weaponize his scars, but she could never erase the truth of sacrifice. He shouted that every uniform carried ghosts, that every protector bore the weight of the fallen, and that mocking that weight was the greatest betrayal of all. His words cracked, his voice raw with emotion, but the crowd heard the sincerity buried in his pain. For a moment, the mob wavered. Some lowered their phones. Others stared at Karen with suspicion creeping into their eyes. The imposters held by the real officers shifted uneasily, their own guilt spilling onto their faces. The tide began to turn, and Karen felt it slipping through her fingers. She raised her phone again, screaming that the story wasn't over, that she had more proof, more lies to bury him with. But the sheriff cut her off, his voice steady, filled with a rage sharpened into truth. He asked the crowd how many of them had been fined for flowers planted in the wrong place, how many had been humiliated for children playing in their own yards, how many had lived in fear of her white dress standing on their doorstep with threats. The mob erupted, their rage no longer aimed at him but at her. Karen's eyes widened, her mask shattering, but she clung to the phone like it was her last weapon. She screamed that none of them understood the real power she held, that the HOA wasn't just rules and fines. It was control, leverage, and secrets buried so deep that even the sheriff couldn't fight them. Her words struck like lightning, filling the crowd with both fury and dread. The sheriff lifted his bleeding wrists again, his voice thunderous. He told her that every empire built on fear eventually crumbles, and tonight her empire was shaking. The neighbors roared with him, their voices a tidal wave, their anger finally aimed at the woman who had ruled them with cruelty. For the first time, Karen looked small, her white dress no longer a symbol of power but of desperation. But she wasn't finished. With a trembling smile, she held up her phone one last time and promised a video no one could deny, a recording that would expose not just him, but the very foundation of everything he had built. The crowd froze, anticipation snapping back into place, hearts racing. The sheriff didn't flinch. His voice cut through the silence, daring her to play it, daring her to end this now. He told her he wasn't afraid of shadows anymore, that the truth always outlives the lies. His defiance sent chills through the mob, phones shaking as viewers online begged to see what came next. Karen's finger hovered above the screen, her smirk trembling with rage, her eyes locked on his. She whispered that this wasn't about him anymore. It was about destroying the entire legacy he stood for. The neighbors screamed for her to show it. The imposters begged to be released. The real officers waited in tense silence. Every heartbeat stretched into eternity. And then Karen pressed her finger down, unleashing the final card in her hand. The screen flickered, the crowd gasped, and the sheriff's face turned to stone. The truth about to play wasn't his destruction. It was something far darker, something that could rip the entire neighborhood apart. The screen lit up, the crowd holding their breath as the video rolled. At first it seemed to confirm Karen's promise. Shadows, hushed voices, figures exchanging envelopes thick with cash. But then the angle shifted, faces came into focus, and the crowd gasped. It wasn't the sheriff. It was Karen. Her voice was clear, commanding, her smile sharp as she threatened families with eviction, demanded payments in exchange for silence, laughed as neighbors' lives crumbled under her rules. The mob erupted. Screams of disbelief, gasps of betrayal, curses thrown into the night. Neighbors who once stood paralyzed under her power now shouted with fury, their voices clashing like thunder. Karen's face drained of color as the video kept playing, every word she thought buried now blaring in front of the very people she ruled. The sheriff stood tall despite the cuffs, his voice calm but burning with truth. He told the crowd this was the empire she built, an empire not of law but of extortion and fear. He said the badge he wore wasn't just a title, it was a shield meant to protect those who couldn't fight back. And tonight, that shield had shattered her lies. Karen tried to snatch the phone back, screaming it was fake, doctored, manipulated. But the real officers had already stepped forward, their radios buzzing, their eyes locked on her with disgust. The imposters, once her pawns, dropped their heads, confessing in trembling voices that she had hired them, that every staged moment was her plan to destroy the sheriff and hold the neighborhood in her grip. The crowd roared, their rage boiling over, the truth undeniable now. The sheriff raised his bleeding wrists once more, chains rattling, and asked the neighbors if they finally saw who the real criminal was. They answered with shouts, cheers, chants calling for her to be taken away. Karen's power collapsed under the weight of their voices. Her white dress no longer a symbol of control, but a ghost of what she once pretended to be. The real officers moved in, cuffing her as she screamed and kicked, her pride crumbling into desperation. She shouted promises of revenge, swore that she would rise again, but no one listened. Phones captured every second as neighbors recorded the fall of the woman who had terrorized them for years. For the first time, justice wasn't a dream whispered behind closed doors. It was alive, pulsing in the air, undeniable. The sheriff's cuffs were finally removed, blood streaking his wrists, but his eyes never left Karen as she was dragged away. He told her the empire of fear she built had finally been buried under the weight of truth. She spat back that this wasn't the end, but her voice cracked, broken under the roar of the crowd. Neighbors surged forward, some with tears in their eyes, thanking him, shouting his name, lifting their voices in relief and triumph. Children who once hid in fear clung to their parents, whispering that the nightmare was over. For the first time in years, hope walked freely on that street. The sheriff stood among them, scarred, bloodied, but unbroken. He told them this wasn't just about one neighborhood or one woman in a white dress. It was about never letting false power chain your life. It was about standing together when fear tries to divide you. His words cut deep, each one branded into the hearts of everyone listening. And then, turning not to the crowd but to every phone recording, he spoke directly to those watching from afar. He said, if you have ever stood against corruption, if you've ever faced lies that tried to crush you, your story matters too. He told them to share their voices, to stand tall, and to never be silent again. He urged them to drop a heart in the comments to show they were still with him, to like the story if they felt the weight of injustice, to subscribe because stories like these weren't just entertainment. They were reminders that truth, no matter how buried, always finds a way to rise. The crowd erupted in cheers, the last of Karen's screams fading into the distance as the police car carried her away. The sheriff lifted his head, scars glinting under the lights, his voice calm but final. Fear had been buried. Truth had prevailed, and the chains that once bound him had become the proof of his victory.